With recent trends in AAA video games pursuing ever-growing levels of graphical fidelity, adaptation of reality within games media has become more prevalent than ever. Beyond visuals, efforts to imitate real-world locations are being made every year with new releases. In this deep dive, we will thoroughly analyze the processes utilized by game developers to design, create, and then iterate upon video game levels based on real-world locales. Focus will be placed on techniques used to make world spaces feel authentic, how said spaces can be designed to accommodate play, and what level designers and environmental artists need to consider when pursuing this type of translation. As a case study, we'll be using Fallout 4 to showcase examples of these techniques and practices within the context of a AAA release. Fallout 4 is set in Boston and has excellent examples of embodying real-world urban locales within its translated world space. To provide context for our analysis of Fallout 4, we'll be looking at the perspectives of level designers, environmental artists, as well as urban planners, specifically individuals who have designed open-world level spaces that take influence from or are based on real-world cities and locations. So, to start, we're going to be using the term spatial embodiment to describe this type of translative process that turns a real-world place into a video game level. Spatial embodiment is how, when adapting a real-world location into a video game, you best translate characteristics of said location into that video game. The goal is to have the digital space be indicative of the real-world source and embody characteristics of that location, while also facilitating play for the game being created. This embodiment doesn't have to represent the real-world location's current conditions. Historical context and backgrounds for cities are often heavily played on when recreating those cities as video game levels. These vignettes, though visually suggestive of the real-world counterpart, often take liberties when facilitating play, regarding the layout of the levels themselves or the architecture occupying those levels. So, understanding this idea of spatial embodiment, we need to look at the two facets of thought designers need to think about: how the level space you create can be authentic to its real-world counterpart, and how it can still allow for interesting play after the fact.
And when we start thinking about how we're going to represent a space like this, we can get into conversations about how accurate must it be. Are we going to try and recreate the city street for street, building for building, brick for brick? And we knew that was never our priority. We were always more focused on authenticity. Can we understand what makes Boston special and distill it down into a core form and represent the Fallout version of the city in a way that would feel familiar and sincere to Bostoners, but also like a real location with a real internal consistency and a sense of place to those who have no familiarity with the city whatsoever.
Joel Burgess here is describing the process of how the world space within Fallout 4 was designed to accommodate player engagement over realism. And what he says is true. Authenticity isn't the same as accuracy. Often games set in real-world spaces can't perfectly adapt the scale of the cities they approximate. So instead, level designers and environmental artists need to work together to adapt an authentic feeling of the space they're recreating. This feeling can be defined with landmarks, the layout of the streets, the density or placement of infrastructure distinguishing the map into different zones, or it can be more abstract, the mood of those different zones and how they feed into one another. The way the skyline of a city in the distance can draw a player's attention to gameplay locations. Beyond getting across the feeling of a space, ensuring that space is playable is just as important.
When we creating urban environment for games, we're not necessarily have to create it realistic. The goal is to make it believable. We have to understand urban environment and then adjust it to our specific needs. And of course, we cannot just simply copy-paste real city from Google Maps, even in cases when we actually, creating like real existing city, because real proportions for cities will not work for our needs.
Artistry reinforcing authenticity isn't enough. You need to make that space able to be engaged with in a way that makes sense. Skylines can support navigation, quests and combat encounters can take place alongside these historical landmarks, and NPCs can task you to explore these embodied places in exchange for rewards. Lincoln Hughes discusses how, as an environmental artist, you can push players to interact with a space depending on how you frame the surrounding environment, comparing the process to how an artist should try to guide the viewer's eyes on a canvas. Just like the way a painter will use leading lines, colors, silhouette, lighting, and contrast to draw the viewer's eyes to a focal point, we must do the same as level artists. Make gameplay locations your focal points, arrange roads so they point to them, sculpt mountains to lead to them, and make colors more discordant around them. Now, keeping these ideas of authenticity and playability in mind, let's look at examples of these practices in Fallout 4. Regarding authenticity, Boston Common is centered next to the city's downtown. It's a park with winding, dividing paths connecting points of interest, like the Parkman Bandstand or the Swan Pond. Lining the edges of the Commons is the start of the Freedom Trail, right next to Park Street Station. The park's surroundings are very urban, with clubs like the Boylston Club, named for the real-life Boylston Street, and a unique fictional landmark being featured, the bar from the television series Cheers, which is also set in Boston. Even further out are historical locales, the Massachusetts State House, Park Street Church, and the Granary Burying Ground, all of which are represented in-game. Each landmark acts as a mirrored reflection, embodying and being authentic to the real-world counterpart in both placement and purpose. Now, though the location is much smaller than its real-world commons, it acts as a nucleus for player engagement. Roads lead out in all directions, each one pulling a player towards different missions and activities. Park Street Station and the Freedom Trail both accommodate important quests, dungeons, and factional content. The Massachusetts State House and Granary Burying Ground act as combat spaces for different types of enemies. And if players ignore the corpses and scattered notes attempting to dissuade them from the park center, they'll find a surprise stepping into the waters of the Swan Pond. Boston Common pays homage to an authentic feeling of its real-world counterpart, while also facilitating interesting play through its usage of landmarks for gameplay content. Our second example can be found north across the Charles River. The USS Constitution is a naval vessel and is the epitome of a hero prop that can be found within Fallout 4. Based on the real-life ship of the same name, the boat is recreated faithfully, with a few obvious exceptions. It's an American warship, built in 1794. In-game, it has a paint scheme reminiscent of the real-world ship, though dulled after 200 years of post-apocalyptic disuse. Now, in shape and color, the boat is a mirror of the real-world Constitution, but just atrophied a little as a result of the setting around it. The red paint and the white stripes are desaturated, revealing the oak hull underneath. When the player gets closer, the accuracy of the vessel shifts to fantastical science fiction. The exterior of the boat is modified with large rocket thrusters, the interior is a mess of haphazard machinery, and the human crew is replaced with robots pretending to be 18th century sailors. Everything about the ship, the initial promise of a real-world sailboat turned rocket-powered, robot-operated war vessel, is what defines the space as an engaging level to interact with as a player. Mechanically, the boat serves as a quest location. Players navigate through the cramped interior halls, making repairs to the vessel's inner circuitry. Surrounding the ship is factional content, initiated by a defense mission which allows players to utilize the boat's cannons to fend off attacking scavengers. Real-world history also reinforces how a player interacts with and engages with this space, as well as the overall theme of the quest itself. In real life, from September to October of 1979, the USS Constitution failed to launch into Boston Harbor, only succeeding on its third attempt and failing its first two. In-game, the ship's robotic crew are attempting to make that same launch, with the player helping get the boat prepared for its second attempt, which, just like in real life, fails spectacularly. The USS Constitution builds on the initial pitch of an 18th century historical landmark through its utilization as a quest hub that draws players in, all framed around a real-world seafaring ship. Both examples represent some of the best ways real-world settings can be authentically portrayed within games media, while also being utilized to creatively support gameplay. They exhibit spatial embodiment in all forms, picking to adapt not what's the most accurate, but what authentically portrays the mood and feeling of the space being translated. Everything that is interpreted, the landmarks, the layout, and usage of space, all serve to allow for interesting gameplay, which in turn serves to provide value to the player. What's lost in this translation, the scale and accuracy of the city streets and urban centers, gives freedom to level designers and environmental artists to tell the stories and create the games they want to create. And it's with that we see the value of spatial embodiment, as a way to frame adaptation of real-world spaces, history and all, into video games.